New videos every day.
Hi, I'm A.A.A.C.N. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist, and the last 3 episodes, we talked about carbohydrates. Remember that? And I'm going to recap just a little bit because today we are going to talk about the glycemic index and fiber and the importance of that. Remember, we talked about carbohydrates. Not all carbohydrates are alike, and how scientists have determined how the body is affected by carbohydrates is they took a whole group of people for a long time and they basically fed them all kinds of different things, and they tested their blood sugar and observed insulin production or insulin secretion. They observed, how long it stayed in the blood, what the glucose levels were, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how they established what's called the glycemic index. So what you want to do is, remember I was talking about, it's not about calories, it's about how your body responds to food. Remember, it's sort of like you have a furnace or you have a flame, a candle flame. Basically, you can have 2 logs the same size, same weight, and how many logs can you go through in a day by holding it over the candle versus putting it in the furnace, obviously. We know. So it's really about your metabolic furnace. And your metabolic furnace is regulated by your hormones. So hormones. Basically, we talked before about insulin. And then we talked about the opposite of insulin, which is glucagon. And glucagon, remember, is stimulated by protein, which we're going to talk about later in a couple of episodes coming down the road. But carbohydrates stimulate insulin secretion. Insulin's a fat-storing hormone. Glucagon is a fat-burning hormone. So obviously, a lot of the diets out there, the South Beach diet, the Atkins diet, etc., they pretty much tout a high protein or a higher protein, low carbohydrate diet. And that's why, because they're trying to stimulate glucagon versus insulin. But really what it comes down to is, let's look at carbohydrates and what would be on the low end of the glycemic index versus what's on the high end. The ones that are on the high end are the ones that stimulate insulin. So remember, insulin is a fat-storing hormone. So we don't want too much insulin. That insulin throws our blood sugar out of balance. A hyperinsulinemic response can cause a hypoglycemic response, and then eventually it wears out the pancreas, and the pancreas can no longer produce insulin, so therefore then we get a hyperglycemic, or diabetes 2. So let's just first go through the glycemic index just briefly. What are the highs and what are the lows, so that you can figure out what's the best way of eating. Now, understand the foods that I'm about to talk about, generally you want to take into consideration, one, if you're trying to lose weight, you want to stay in the low glycemic foods at all times. If you have diabetes, or if you are a certain age, if you are perimenopause or menopause or postmenopause, you really want to watch the glycemic index. If you're elderly, you want to watch the glycemic index. If you're a child and you're of normal weight, parents want to watch the glycemic index, but you have a little bit more leeway. But if you're a child who has an overweight problem, you definitely want to stay in the low glycemic categories. So first of all, in the area of sugar, for example, you're going to find the high glycemic index is going to be honey, molasses, corn syrup, certainly the high fructose corn syrup. Those are typical high glycemic sugars. Basically, some solutions for those. You can use substitutes such as stevia. If you're not familiar with stevia, stevia is a very, very sweet herb, so you really don't need a lot. You need a couple of drops. I prefer the tincture over the powder, but it does come in powder packets. That is an herbal sweetener that has actually no glycemic response whatsoever. It actually helps to regulate blood sugar. So you can use stevia as a substitute. but you really want to stay away from the high glycemic sugars. Now, fruits. The high glycemic fruits are bananas, watermelons, pineapple, raisins, dried fruits in general. Be very careful of dry fruits because you really have highly concentrated the sugar. We think of dry foods as or dry fruit as being healthy for us, which, yes, all of these things can be. Certainly, bananas and watermelon have high potassium, etc. But again, if you're in that category, you really have to be careful of these. And you don't want to do, certainly, like dried banana chips or dried pineapple, things like that. Got to watch that. Dried mango. They're all delicious. If you're an active child or if you have active children and they are not obese, then these might be okay snack foods, but you really want to watch it. If your child is starting to gain weight, stay off of all that dried fruit or dried pressed fruit. Let's see, vegetables. You want to stay away from the starchy vegetables, especially the lower fiber vegetables such as potatoes, white potatoes. For example, on the glycemic index, white potatoes versus sweet potatoes or yams. Believe it or not, white potatoes are up in the 150 on a scale from 100 being pure glucose. The white potato actually turns into sugar faster than pure glucose. But yams, on the other hand, or sweet potatoes, is actually fairly low on the glycemic index. And the reason why? Because of the fiber. The fiber makes all the difference. Remember, when you are trying to, we went through this in the carbohydrate conversation, when you're trying to digest and break down that carbohydrate, if it's encased in fiber, fiber is very difficult. We're going to talk about fiber in a minute, but especially insoluble fiber, the human body doesn't have a lot of digestive enzymes to break down that fiber. All right, so it takes a lot longer to get it into the bloodstream, and that's the important factor. Unlike other animals and mammals that have higher enzymes for that, and they have a whole different digestion system, such as a cow, for example, that can really just digest all kinds of fiber. We humans, we don't do that very well. So when you have something encased in fiber, this is another reason or another argument for whole foods versus processed foods. I said this and somebody asked me to say this slower, so I'm going to say this is my motto. If it's popped, puffed, flaked, floured, shredded, or instant, it's refined. And I'm going to add two other things to it. If it's juiced, by all means, it is very refined. And this is, again, taking that long chain string of pearls and basically cutting it down into simpler sugars. So if it's juiced or strained or any sort of way of processing or breaking it down, it's going to go higher up into the glycemic index category. But again, the higher the fiber, the slower the process. When you also combine it with fat or protein, it slows the process down even more. So that's an important consideration. So vegetables, we're talking potatoes, corn, carrots, beet, turnips, parsnips. Those very starchy kinds of vegetables are high on the glycemic index. Let's see, grains. That's another thing. Now, usually if it's white, basically it's high on the glycemic index. Really, there's very few things in nature that are pure white. So we know that if it's white bread, and I've had people say to me, well, I don't eat wheat, RADHlA. I eat white bread. Okay, white bread is wheat. But it has been so degenerated down to, the endosperm. Actually, the grain itself, whether it's wheat or any other kind of grain, remember, has a germ, and it has a bran, and then it has the endosperm. Now, back in the turn of the century, as we started to get into the Industrial Revolution, we really had to bring food into the cities and out of the farms, and we started having to figure out ways of doing this. And what happened was, in the bran And in the germ of the grain is where those great polyunsaturated fatty acids are. Well, remember, those fats are so delicate that when they're exposed to light, temperature, such as heat, or oxygen, what happens? They basically go rancid. So we didn't know back then about how to keep food fresh, and we figured, well, we don't need that fiber, so let's just take it out. So you take 86% of the fiber out of the grain by removing the bran and the germ. Remember, wheat germ oil and bran oil? Okay, so out with that. We didn't realize that along with the bran and the germ goes another about 80% or more of the B vitamins, especially the minerals that are essential to the grain, out the door. And then, of course, we didn't understand the importance of those essential fatty acids that we now need. You know, wheat germ oil, very, very good essential fatty acid and things like that. So once we stripped that grain down into its endosperm, it was really denatured so much and then ground and then bleached and all of that other stuff that it really, really became almost a pure carbon atom, pure sugar, basically. So white breads, white rolls, all of that stuff, really, really stay away from it. It's actually, white bread is what's used as they either use, when they were doing the glycemic index studies, they either used pure glucose or white bread. That's what they used to test the level. So we got to think about that. Pastas. Now usually the thicker pastas, and again, if it's white, there's your answer. But usually the thicker pastas, the big flat pastas, the large pasta shapes, those are usually higher on the glycemic index. Cereals. Well, pretty much all packaged cereals. I don't care what it is. There are some that are better than others, but the only ones that are really low on the glycemic index are the real all-bran cereal, the bran checks. Those are the real high bran, real high fiber cereals. Those you can get away with. Those are a little bit lower because of that fiber. That fiber slows that glycemic index down. Then, of course, snacks, well, typically potato chips, corn chips, popcorn, rice cakes, pretzels. Now, people say to me all the time, well, Roddy, I thought that popcorn and rice cakes were great. This is a great diet food. You know, they're so low in calorie. And especially if you air pop it, well, not such a good idea. Remember, we're talking about that long chain of carbohydrates. When you pop it, what happens? You actually explode those saccharide molecules into simpler sugars. Same thing that happens when you puff rice. You explode it. A little dirt here. You explode it. So these are not good snack foods if you're trying to lose weight, and if you've got any kind of glycemic issues, which chances are 75% of the population does. So you have to be real careful of those kind of snack foods. And then alcohol. For the most part, beer is high on the glycemic index. Liqueurs for sure. They're almost pure sugar. And all liquor except for red wine. Red wine is lower on the glycemic index. Who knew? So what's low on the glycemic index? Well, first of all, in the fruit category, anything that is not on the high glycemic. So bananas and watermelon and pineapples, those are all on the high. But other fruits are low, especially the berries. The berries are very, very high in fiber, and they're really the lowest on the glycemic index. Grapefruit is also low on the glycemic index. So those are the lower. And then the sort of medium are your apples and peaches and pears and things like that. Vegetables, pretty much all except for the starchy vegetables we mentioned before. So high water content vegetables, your lettuces, your cauliflower and kale and all your greens and all of those are low on the glycemic index. Cucumbers, etc. Breads. Now, when you're talking about breads, it goes like this. It goes sprouted grain, stone ground, whole wheat, wheat, white. Okay? Now, if it says enriched, forget enriched. Yeah, okay. The FDA demands that after they've processed the heck out of these grains, that they put some of the vitamins and minerals back in. They don't put necessarily the fiber back in, nor do they have to put the amount taken out. They only have to put 10% of the vitamins back in. They're only, forced to put 10% back into that grain bread. So, enriched really doesn't mean a whole lot, or it can be very, controversial. So sprouted grains. Now, interestingly enough, and for those of you who have a gluten intolerance or a problem with gluten, when you sprout the grain, the gluten actually gets destroyed. So you're going to tolerate sprouted grain much, much better. These are grains you'll find Ezekiel bread. Generally, you'll find these in the frozen food section. Manna bread. It used to be called A.A.C.N bread, but it's called manna bread. Now, manna bread is unleavened. So it's kind of like a block about this big, and it's very heavy, but very, very good. It's not the kind you'd make sandwiches out of, but it's an excellent bread. It's really a combination of brown rices, grains, legumes, nut seeds, and all of that. It actually came from the Bible recipe in Ezekiel that was pronounced in the Bible as the perfect food. So it's high in protein, low on the glycemic index, very tasty. My favorite is the brown rice millet. That's my favorite. And the secret with A.A.C.N bread is make a couple of slices and put it in your toaster oven if you want it toasted, and double toast it, even triple toast it, because it's extremely moist. So, but when you double or triple toast it, it gets nice and crispy and still stays moist on the inside. So, very, very tasty. Whole grain pita, pumpernickel, whole rye. Now, whole rye also doesn't look like the deli rye that you get, at the supermarket. Whole rye is also very dense, quite tasty. Got a little bit more of a sour taste to it, but it's really good. Whole German rye comes in a loaf about this big, and it's very thinly sliced. And I like using the whole rye. Putting a little bit of garlic butter and Parmesan cheese on it, and then grilling it and toasting it. Very yummy. Very good. Okay, grains. Well, of course, brown rice, barley, bulgur wheat, and kasha. Those are low on the glycemic index. And then the pastas, you can get, if you really don't want to do wheat, whole wheat, of course, is lower on the glycemic index. But I use rice pasta, brown rice pasta, which is actually really tasty and holds together better. It's more like the white pasta that we're used to, but it really has it's got a nice flavor, and it does hold together better. And then the thinner strands versus the thicker pasta is lower on the glycemic index. And then bean threads, all of those are low on the glycemic index. Snacks, good snacks are nuts, olives, cheese, pita chips. These are better snacks for you, even though they're high in fat. Most of it is good fat, a low-fat cheese, but, goat cheese, good, excellent, good snack. And then miscellaneous, like eggs. If you want to snack, hard-boiled eggs, great. The nut butters with no sugar. I talked about in the fat conversation months ago, I talked about the nut butters. And you definitely want to stay with the natural nut butters, almond butter, cashew butter, peanut butter, because they have no hydrogenated fat and they have no sugar. All right, so make sure you read the labels. No hydrogenated fat, no sugar, no other oils, palm seed oil, etc., etc. So really get the natural. Those are the good snacks. So that's the deal with the glycemic index. As far as your fiber, you've got two kinds of fiber. You've got soluble and insoluble. And the insoluble is basically your fruits and your vegetables. The insoluble means it does not dissolve in water. So therefore, this is kind of like your Mother Nature's broom, right? It doesn't dissolve, it doesn't break down in the human body, so this is what helps to flush out our entire alimentary system. You know, the colon, everything gets cleaned out. So fiber, the insoluble fiber is very, very important. But then we have what's called soluble fiber. These would be your gums, mucilage, pectins. And you'll find things like psyllium and oat bran are your insoluble. These are actually good for cardiovascular. Also Mother Nature's broom, but can be soluble and get into the bloodstream, etc. So that's the story on the glycemic index and fiber. I hope that's helped. I welcome your comments and keep listening to Psychetruth. Make sure that you sign in if you haven't and become a member so that you can get more of these tapes. Coming up next, we will be talking about, I think I'm going to be talking about protein pretty soon. So stay tuned. All right? We'll see you then.
If you liked this video, we have hundreds of more alternative videos ranging from sexual health to psychology to mind control. So if you liked it, go ahead and click on me to enter the Psychetruth channel.